our youth is looking like around suicide.
All right, thank you, Mary. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me here. My name is Thao. I am a public health social worker. I'm based in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, and I'm really grateful to be here with you all. So before we jump into talking about Hmong youth, I really want to start talking about just who I am and where I'm coming from, and then I'm going to have Bonnie introduce herself as well. So like I said, I'm a public health social worker based in the Twin Cities, and I've had the opportunity to work across various different sectors. I currently work in clinical research. I've had experience working in evaluation and applied research, as well as working as a mental health practitioner for some time. And so I've really had the opportunity to work across various different levels in the system. And Banya, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Bonya, last name Xiong. I am a second-year PhD student at the University of California, Irvine. I study environmental and occupational health, really focusing on violence prevention research. And I also currently work as a community engaged coordinator at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. So I play dual roles and doing a little bit of this and a little bit of that. I've been in research for maybe almost 10 years now.
All right. And so before we jump into the research itself, as I mentioned before, I want to tell a little bit story about just how I got to this project here. So back in grad school about 3 years ago, I had actually wrote this paper for a class. It was one of the last classes I took before graduating. And it was with one of my co-authors, Dr. Marizan Ramirez, and it was for a injury and violence prevention class. And so I wrote the paper because I'm Hmong and I see the issues in the Hmong community, and we had a data set, so I thought it'd be really cool to see what were the levels of suicidality in the Hmong community. And so I submitted the paper, got an A, thank God. I thought it was going to be done after that. However, about a year and a half later, by just a stroke of luck, I jumped into a meeting and saw that Marizan was there along with Bonya, and we were talking about research in the schools, looking at mental health and suicidality in the schools. And that's when they had started to encourage me to work together with Bonya to get this paper published, get it cleaned up, do a little bit more analysis, and get it published and presented to the community. And so that's what we're doing now. And so, so now I'm going to jump into the research. So before I talk about Hmong youth, I want to paint a broader stroke, talking about just what the data looks like right now in terms of suicidality, suicide deaths. And we're going to start off with just what it looks like for the Asian American community in general, and then we're going to narrow it down there. And so, if you look at this figure right here, according to the CDC, suicide was the leading cause of death for Asian Americans aged 10 to 19 between 2018 and 2023. And to put this into perspective, nearly 36% of recorded deaths in this demographic were due to suicide. And so when we compare these figures alongside with other racial groups within the same time frame, it becomes pretty evident that a higher proportion of Asian American adolescents are dying by suicide compared to all other racial groups in this data set. And so this last graph is derived from a trend analysis based on the national mortality data from the Center for Health Statistics. And so the researchers discovered that among Asian Americans, males aged 10 to 19, as shown on this blue line right here, suicide rates or suicide death rates have increased by about 72%. And then if you look at the red or orangish line on the bottom there, suicide rates in Asian American females had risen by over 125% within just the past 22 years in this data set. And so that's pretty striking. But although these data are pretty striking, like I said, there's an issue across all of them. So the issue is that they aggregate Asians into a single group. And as Mary was talking about earlier, is like, we all know that Asian as a group is a large and diverse. We all have different diasporic experiences, and it wouldn't be accurate grouping us into a single category. And so I want to dive a little bit deeper into just how diverse the community can be and the experiences that we have. So I have two graphs here. So this first graph really looks at the median household income in 2015 across various different Asian American ethnic groups. And so if you look at that red dotted line right there, that was the AAPI median household income in 2015, which is slightly below $75,000 per household. And looking at that, it was above the US median household income of about a little over 50,000. But when you break down the data and look at the individual ethnic group levels, you see a huge disparity where at the very top you see Asian Indians had a median household income of about $100,000. But then if you look at the lower percentile or the lower quartiles, for Hmong families, the median household income was slightly below 50,000. And so looking at that, there's just a huge discrepancy between the just income itself. And the same thing can be seen in health insurance data, where it's not shown here, but then Asian Americans as an aggregate were shown to be less likely to be uninsured. I think they were second, just right behind white Americans. But when you break it down and look at each individual ethnic group, you can see that there are some who are less uninsured, and then there are some who are more uninsured, as you can see in this graph here. And so now let's begin with the why. So why did we choose to focus on Hmong adolescents? And so firstly, and perhaps most importantly, there's been a significant demand for support, awareness, and suicide prevention within our community due to the tragic loss of many of our young individuals to suicide. And while we as a community are witnessing and experiencing these heartbreaking events, there's just a lack of substantial research to support our experiences. And unfortunately, with how the system works right now, research and data are so essential into developing programs designed to assist our youth and fund the existing programs to better help our youth. And so, reflecting on our discussion about disaggregating data, it's evident that many studies involving Hmong youth tend to categorize them with a broader group, such as all Asian, Southeast Asian, or other Asian. However, very few studies have placed Hmong youth in the center of the research. And so, what are the gaps in the research now? And so, while we were doing our literature review, we were faced with a lot of challenges finding current and relevant studies that really focus specifically on our primary demographic, Hmong-American adolescents. A lot of the existing studies really focused on the new refugees who came here. So back in the 80s and 90s, when our parents, grandparents, or maybe even some of us were just coming to the United States. And so we were looking at a lot of PTSD, a lot of depression as a result of the migration and the war. And on top of that, even more current studies, they tend to focus on Hmong American adults, whether in the community or college students. And so there's this huge gap in understanding of what are the challenges that a lot of Hmong American youth are experiencing. However, we did find a couple of studies in the past that were published within the past few years that really did look at Hmong mental health, suicide in the Hmong community. So we found a couple studies that looked at the connection between adverse childhood experiences and suicidality, so suicide ideation, suicide attempts, and non-suicidal self-injury. And with these studies, they did see a positive correlation between the number of ACEs a child experiences and the three outcomes that I had mentioned. And so this is a really great start to adding to the body of literature on understanding mental health needs and challenges in our Hmong youth, and that's why we want to continue to add to that bulk of research. And so I want to talk about a couple of our study aims. And so the first thing that we wanted to learn in our study is what is the prevalence of lifetime suicidal ideation, or indicated by SI, and suicide attempts, indicated by SA, among Hmong-American adolescents in Minnesota. And our second aim was to understand how do perceptions of others' caring impact lifetime SI and SA. And so I'm going to pass the mic over to Banya to talk about our methods and our analysis.
Thank you, Austin. Thank you all for being here with us today. I'm going to dive right into what we did, and then we'll talk about what it is that we found. So we did a secondary data analysis. What this means is there's an already existing data set out there, and we took that data set and we just analyzed it, right? So in terms of the work that Austin and I did is we did not create these questions, we did not do any of the engagement to get these questions answered by folks. We used the Minnesota Student Survey, which is, for folks who are from Minnesota, it is a survey that goes out to our schools in Minnesota every 3 years, and it asks a multitude of questions. Some of these questions include anxiety, depression, it also includes perceptions of others' caring, low self-esteem, questions around suicidality. And so, given this, we thought, with Minnesota being such a place where a lot of Hmong folks call home, that means that we'll have a lot more students in this data set that identifies as Hmong. So when you do analysis, oftentimes you're looking at relationships and you're looking at an equation. So what we did is Austin and I were interested in understanding perceptions of others' caring, which is whether your parents, the people around you, believing that your friends, and the people around you care about you, and how that impacts your youth's experiences with suicide ideation and suicide attempts. And then we control for sex, grade, and social economic status. What that means is basically, when it comes to experiences of suicide ideation and attempts, oftentimes your sex, your social economic status impacts the way you experience those. And so if we're looking at the relationship of perception of others' caring, and we take into consideration these differences in sex, social economic status, and grades, we're looking at the impact of directly from what people caring and how that impacts your experiences of ideation and attempts. Before I dive into the results, I do want to share with you all just a little bit about who we're looking at in terms of our students. In Minnesota, there are over 130 students that answers these questions, the Minnesota Student Surveys, every 3 years. For our population specifically, we get about 2,000 of those being Hmong youth. For folks who are in research, 130, that's a large number and you want that. But 2,000, that's too tiny, it's irrelevant, and people often don't use that, right? But for us, as a Hmong community, like Mary shared earlier, 330,000 Hmong people living in the US, 2,000 of our data set includes Hmong youth. That's a large set for us to review and look and make sure that the research is including our narratives and a lot of what is being published in the US in terms of research and understanding what's going on with our youth. And so you see here for 2019 and 2022, we have male and female around 50% each for both years. We looked at 8th grade, 9th grade, and 11th grade students. And so what it's basically telling you is that out of the 2,000 students, around 836 of those 2,000 students are 11th graders in 2019. And then we were also interested in looking at our LGBTQ plus students as well. And one thing to note, we don't really know why this is the case, but in 2019, we get about 7% of our students identifying as part of the LGBTQ plus community. And then in 2022, we get about 22% of our youth identifying as so. So there are a lot of multitude of reasons why that could have been the case. One is in 2022, the Minnesota Student Survey included more questions so that students can truly identify themselves differently, right? It gives them options to their identities there. So I'm gonna dive right in. I do want to preface before I talked about the prevalence rate of what our students are experiencing when it comes to suicidation and attempts. It could be a little alarming. If you need to step out of the room, feel free to do so, and we can talk a little bit about it afterwards if you want. But we're gonna start right ahead with suicidation for 2019-2022, and then we'll look at prevalence rate for suicidal attempts for 2019 and then 2022. So we see that in 2019, about 1 in those 5 students, so out of the 2,000 students that responded to the survey, about 1 in 5 students reporting having seriously considered attempting suicide. And this number increases in 2022 to 1 in 4 students that have seriously considered attempting suicide. And this is alarming, right? When we think about our family, the amount of youth that we have in our family alone, that's probably 3 or 4, maybe 5 of our youth that we live with day to day that experiences this without us truly knowing. And so, as I do want to talk further into what we found for suicide attempts, and then from there we'll talk about characteristics. But for lifetime suicide attempts, in 2019, about 1 in 13 Hmong students reported having attempted suicide in their lifetime. That's in 2019. This increased in 2022 to 1 in 12 students. So then you start thinking about your family again. You get about 12 youth. That means 1 of them have tried, and you probably don't even know. Right? That's why it's so important, the type of work that you are doing in the space of mental health and research, mental health, and the space of social work, and the space of counseling, how important your work is. Now I'm going to dive in and talk a little about the differences and characteristics I showed you guys earlier to the rates of suicide ideation and attempts. So here I'll walk us through what this graph means. We're looking at prevalence of rate for lifetime suicide ideation and attempts by sex. And our blue bar, that represents our male students. Orange is our female students. And these 4 bars represent suicide ideation. The last 4 bars represent suicide attempts. The percentages is telling you the rates of what the students are reporting at. So there's 2 things to note here with this graph. We see that consistently our female students are reporting suicide ideation and attempts more than our male students. But you see that in 2019 and 2022, our male students, for some reason, which we don't know, reported twice their experiences of ideation and attempts. So this goes back to what it means when you start thinking about programmings for youth, when you start thinking about interventions, prevention, and the type of work that you put into this is truly understanding how students are impacted and how potentially these identities impact the way they experience ideation and attempts as well. So next, we were interested in looking at grades. So what this is telling you, blue again is 8th graders, orange 9th graders, green is 11th graders. First sets of bars are for ideation, second sets suicidal attempts, 2019 to 2022 in comparison. You're seeing it's pretty consistent across in terms of students experiencing ideation attempts for grades, right? 11th graders are experiencing a little bit higher, a little bit more than our 9th and 8th graders, but it basically tells us that students are still experiencing this whether they change grades or not, and that each year it just keeps going up, whether that's by little or by a lot. This next graph that I'm going to show you guys might be a little bit more daunting, not daunting, but it gives you a little bit more perspective into the experiences of our youth. We're looking at our LGBTQ plus students versus our students who reported being straight or heterosexual. Again, blue bar is our LGBTQ plus students, and then orange bar are our students that identify as being straight. And you see that our students who are part of the LGBTQ plus community are experiencing suicide ideation and attempts almost 3 times that of our students that identify as being straight. And if you see, attempts and ideation in 2019 is up about 57%, so that means more than 1 out of 2 of our students who are part of this community are experiencing ideation. Compare that to what I showed you all before, which looked at the whole, right? That's 1 in 5 in 2019 they're experiencing. And so you start to think about, when you start thinking about your programming, your intervention, and where it could be most effective and where you can support students most, is you need to start thinking, we also need to start thinking about what do these identities, what does that mean, right, in our community? There can be a multitude of reasons why. And that's why research is so important. Now, what I'm gonna dive into next is we're talking more about protective factors now, and we'll talk about one, and for this specifically, and if you're interested in anything more, feel free to reach out to me afterward. But when we look at If our youth believes that the people around them cares about them, their experiences of ideation and attempts lowers, right? So what this graph is basically showing us is students who report having high perceptions of others caring about them. In 2019, they're 2.7 times less likely to report that they have experienced suicidation, and in 2022, 2.4 times less likely to experience suicidation. And then for attempts, if they believe that they perceive that the people around them cares about them, in 2019, they're 2.3 times less likely to have attempted suicide, and in 2022, 2.6 times less likely to have attempted suicide. And so when we start thinking about programming, I think we're always in the right track. We're talking about, making sure that our youth feels loved, that they feel cared for, that they feel heard from. And so what Austin and I were also interested in talking about or understanding better is, does it matter who out of all these people in your community cares about you being more protective? And so what I'm gonna show you next, I'll walk you guys through this as well, is we're looking at ideation for 2019 and 2022. The question changed a little bit. So just to remind you all, this is secondary data analysis. That means that we're just taking questions from a survey that's already been developed. So Austin, I have no indication on, or have we did not write who it is in terms of the relationships, right? And so the perception of others' caring scales changed a little bit from 2019 to 2022, but it still gives us the same thing. What it's saying here is that parents will always be number one. Your parents caring about you will always be number one in making sure that you feel safe, secure, and you don't experience lifetime suicidation or attempts. So students in 2019 who believes that their parents care more about them, there are 76% less likely to experience suicide ideation. And in 2022, 73% less likely to experience suicide ideation. So that's what this is telling you. Surprisingly, Austin and I thought that friends would be a little bit up higher, because nowadays when you think about our generation of youth, they care a lot about their friends and what their friends think. But they rank last out of the number of, they ranked last and when we start looking about, does it matter, right? Where the relationship looks like. At the end of the day, everybody matters. Everybody caring matters, and it just combines on top of each other. But when you start thinking about programming, parents are a number one point of intervention for youth. Parents, adults, families, even teachers are before friends. And so this is the same exact format, but for suicidal attempts now. Again, parents still ranks number one. So it's saying that in 2019, if students report that their parents care about them, they are 62% less likely to have attempted suicide in their lifetime. And in 2022, 75% less likely to have attempted suicide in their lifetime. And so that's how you read each of these graphs. And it's telling you, again, parents, adults, and adult relatives, your family matters a lot. And it makes sense, right? For our community and our collective community, we care a lot about not just our family, but the people around us and the people that we see every day. And so I'm going to give it back to Austin, but I do want to share again, this is why research is so important. It helps us identify point of prevention, point of interventions. It helps us identify and understand what it is that's going on. We all know what it is that's going on in our community because we see it, we experience it, and our kids are going through all of this, right? We know what's going on, but it's validating to see the numbers to understand exactly what it is. And what this does is it also helps support a lot of grant funding that goes into programming such as this, the mental health conference. And so it's so important to start thinking about how we can build evidence-based programs and evidence-based statistics to understand what it is that our community is experiencing so that we can start building really strong and effective programming for our youth. Is that Austin?
Amongst our Hmong girls and LGBTQ plus youth. And I didn't write it here, but what Banya had mentioned as well is that there's just been this huge spike in suicide ideation amongst our Hmong boys as well. And so that's always important to acknowledge as well. Students who have a stronger perception of others caring for them are more protected from experiencing lifetime suicidal ideation and lifetime suicide attempts. And to narrow that down even more is that students who felt like their parents cared more about them were more protected from experiencing or reporting lifetime suicidal ideation and attempts. And so now where do we go from here? What's next? And so Vanya did a great job of explaining some of the next steps and what we can do next. So first of all, this is a fairly small study, and it was based off of only Minnesota data. And so this will not and should not be the only study that focuses on suicide among our Hmong youth. We use a secondary data set that had fixed questions, so it would be really impactful to try to collect some primary data using more tailored measures so we can carefully dive deeper into how our youth are impacted by suicidality. So this might be looking at more specific questions, changing the methods, moving from fully quantitative methods to more qualitative studies to really look at the nuance in suicide ideation or suicidality. We're doing a mixed methods approach with a larger sample or a more national sample. And so our findings may be a great first step into informing future interventions to help address suicide amongst our youth. So for example, because we're seeing such high rates of suicide ideation and suicide attempts in our girls as well as our LGBTQ plus youth, future programs could really dive into supporting these groups. So, including some therapy groups, whether they're psychoeducation groups, skills groups, or even just community programs to build their social capacity. But this could also be, not only that, but then parents' involvement may be a huge thing to invest in and to focus on in our current interventions and future programming. And so this might be including the parents more in the treatment planning, doing some mediation and teaching the families on how to connect with one another. And also, if we're gonna dive deeper into some programming for LGBTQ plus youth as well, not just focusing on supporting them, but also supporting or giving some support groups for the parents, because a lot of times these youth, they feel alienated, they feel disconnected from their families out of the fear of being rejected, being hurt. And so really providing support groups for the parents to teach them how to love and support their LGBTQ plus youth as well. There was studies out there that have shown that LGBTQ youth who have parents and caregivers who are accepting of them and their identity have less likely chances of experiencing suicidality compared to LGBTQ youth who have family members or parents or caregivers who reject them or do not support them in their identity. And so these types of interventions may be really helpful for our Hmong queer trans youth as well. And so that was the end of our presentation. So I thank you guys for listening to us, and thank you for letting us share our research with you all.
And if you have any questions, I do want to respect the time. We have about 7 minutes for questions, so if you have any questions, please raise your hand.
So I have a question. It's maybe for Austin and Bongina.
Why don't you please come up?
So I know you guys were talking about the stats on suicide ideation and suicide attempts, and girls were much higher than boys. But is it still true, or maybe it's just anecdotal, or maybe that's where the research needs to go? Is it still true that boys are still completing suicides at a higher rate?
Yeah, so usually in research, the reason why boys are completing suicide at a higher rate is because they choose more lethal ways of doing it versus girls, right? So that is still true, but the experiences of our youth and of our male versus female students are also true, right? Is there? Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted people to be aware that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah, in Minnesota, the Department of Health of Minnesota, they have done some research, and men complete more suicide attempts than females. And it's because they take more lethal and more violent routes versus women are more passive in how they attempt suicide. Any other questions?
I think we have a question that kind of aligns with that. And this might be kind of sensitive in terms of having on the survey. Did the survey ask about like methods, like suicide attempts,
No, so the survey is, the only questions on suicidality is, have you considered, have you actually attempted? They don't ask in details, and I think one thing to consider is it's questions for youth, and so, and also, you know, the schools may also have in like a play into what can you ask and what you can't ask. And in a space, students take these surveys at school in front of everyone, and in a way, and so these may be, you know, not an accurate representation because students might not feel as comfortable to answer because of the youth around.
So taking off of what you just said there, do you think there's less likelihood that boys or young men would answer truthfully because of the shame or guilt that may be related to answering truthfully on a survey like that versus females or young men?
I can't say distinctly, right? Thinking is an opinion, so my opinion around it might be different, but in terms of response bias in general, when it comes to research, is you take that into a lot of consideration, even with any question. And so yes, there's a chance that, you know, male students might be less likely to answer these questions because it's more shameful, but there's also a chance that female students are also less likely to answer these questions because it's also shameful. Yeah.
I have a question, but does suicide attempts also include self-harm with no meaning to die, but moreover just to harm yourself?
So in the surveys, they ask both self-harm and they ask some questions on self-harm, and that's distinctly different from asking questions on if students have attempted suicide.
Another one is, would you consider these graphs to, if it was on a college age range, would these increase or decrease?
Okay, so the question is, if these were to be age range, college age range students, would these rates increase or decrease? Those are great questions. What's really difficult about research is you can't apply these rates to a different age group. You can't apply the rates to, let's say in Minnesota, I can't apply these rates to California specifically, right? What it does is it provides an exploratory analysis. In terms of would it increase or decrease, it's a lot of just opinion based from my end. It's like what I've read in terms of the research, what I understood. And I personally don't feel that it increases or decreases. I think it stays pretty consistent, and then it may increase with years for both groups. Mary, do you have any? Yeah.
You had mentioned a little bit about medicine, if necessary. I want to know what your perspective is on medicine in terms of who are the people that you work for, what are their perspective, and what are some helpful tips in how you can talk about medicine and still talk about mental illness in a sense?
Yeah, I never start a conversation with parents or children with medication. That is something that I explore with them as an option, as a way to support the level of severity of their mental health. And we will often try, especially because it's the Hmong community, we will often try every other route before we come to medication as an option. Not saying that it's not an option. We talk about the different types of medications. We do a lot of psychoeducation around their symptoms, around the medication. I also even schedule some, have them schedule an appointment with their primary doctor or a psychiatrist to really talk about the effects of the medication. And so to be culturally sensitive to our community, I never start a conversation with medication. I'll talk about herbal medication as an option because for some reason we're more open to herbal medication and more traditional healing methods. But Western mental health supports are still very stigmatized. And so it's something that we have to walk very carefully in the conversations, because to really build trust and seeing effectiveness in the work that we do, that relationship is so important. And if the first thing that they do is step into my office and I'm talking about medication, that's already like, they've already put up a wall around that. So thank you for that question. Last one, and then,
Did you ask questions about what were those attempts and what is a common attempt?
Yeah, so with this data set, unfortunately, the questions did not ask what the type of attempt was. It was very much just a binary yes or no if they had seriously considered or they had made attempts at suicide. So it would be really nice or interesting to know what these types of attempts were and more reasons behind it, but that would have to be done in future studies.
thank you guys. And so I told you I would bring out my inner resources, okay? And so I'm gonna pick one for us, and this is just, I want you guys to go away with this inner resource. And the one that I chose is no, okay? Stop, no more, not now. It says, inner resource no wants me to remember I can set limits and boundaries. Saying no is an act of self-love. May you be clear about what you want and need. May you set and express your boundaries with confidence. And may you feel free to say no, no more, or not now. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.